Hello and welcome to our introduction of Chapter 7, Individual and Group Decision Making, and how managers make things happen. So now in the classroom we will have a further discussion regarding these questions, but these are basically major questions that we should be able to have or be able to answer by the time we finish this chapter. So let's take a look at the questions. So how do we know when we are being logical or illogical? How can I make sure that my decisions are ethical? What is the process for making a decision? What are the barriers to rational decision making? And how can I improve my collaboration with others? So now there are basically two kinds of decision making. You have rational and non-rational. In the book Thinking Fast and Slow, psychologist Daniel Kahneman, winner of the 2002 Nobel Prize in Economics, describes two kinds of thinking, which he labels System 1 and System 2. So now System 1 is intuitive and largely unconscious. It operates automatically and quickly. It is our fast, automatic, intuitive, and largely unconscious mode. For example, as when we detect hostility in a voice or detect that one object is more distant than another. And then there's System 2. Now, System 2 is really analytical and conscious. It's our slow, deliberate, analytical, and consciously effortful mode of reasoning, which kind of swings into action when we have to, like, say, fill out a task form or park a car in a narrow space. Now, rational decision making, the rational model of decision making, it really explains how managers should make decisions. It assumes managers will make logical decisions that will be optimum in furthering the organization's best interests. Now, this is also called the classical model. Now, typically there are 4 stages associated with rational decision making, and we'll discuss those on this slide here. So now you have stage 1, which really identifies the problem or opportunity by determining the actual versus the desirable. Now stage 2, you're going to think up alternative solutions. And when you do this, you want to think of the obvious and the creative. So you want to use both. You want to, in stage 3, evaluate alternatives and select a solution. And when you're doing stage 3 is when you really want to balance those decisions or weigh those decisions against 3 things: their ethicality, their feasibility, and their effectiveness, right? And then you have stage 4, which is implement and reevaluate the solution chosen. For implementation to be successful, you need to do 2 things. You need to plan carefully, especially if reversing an action will be difficult. You need to make careful plans for implementation. Some plans or some decisions may even require written plans as well. You want to be sensitive to those affected. You really need to consider how the people affected may feel about the change or the decision. Will they be inconvenienced? Will they feel insecure? Will they feel fearful? Now, all of these can trigger resistance to a decision-making process or any change. This is why it helps to give employees and customers actual latitude during a changeover in business practices or working arrangements. Now, what's wrong with the rational model? The rational model is prescriptive. It describes how managers ought to make decisions, and it doesn't really describe how managers actually do make decisions. The rational model also makes some highly desirable assumptions, like the managers have complete information, they're able to make an unemotional analysis, they're able to make the best decision for the organization. These are some assumptions that normally get made in the rationale model. But then let's look at the non-rational decision-making model. Non-rational models of decision-making really assumes that decision-making is nearly always uncertain and risky. And this makes it difficult for managers to make optimal decisions. Now, two types are discussed. You have the satisficing and intuition. Now, the non-rational model uses the two, satisficing and intuition, and let's talk about those a little bit. So now, during the 1950s, economist and Nobel Peace Prize winner Herbert Simon began to study how managers actually make decisions. Now, from his research, he proposed that managers could not act truly logically because their rationality was bound by so many restrictions. Now, because of constraints, managers don't typically make an exhaustive search for the best alternative. Instead, they tend to follow what Simon calls the satisficing model. While satisficing might seem to be a weakness, it may well outweigh any advantages gained from delaying making a decision until all information is in and all alternatives are weighed. The intuition model. Now, intuition is making a choice without the use of conscious thought or logical inference. It stems from both expertise and automated experience. Now, it's important to try to develop your intuitive skills because they are as important as rational analysis in many decisions, and some guidelines for this development are on this slide. So another important aspect of decision making and ethics, the ethical behavior of business people, discussed at length in Chapter 3. So you may want to take a look back at Chapter 3 and review. It discussed at length in Chapter 3 has become an increasing concern in recent years. So, if you have taken a moment to pause and go back to Chapter 3, or maybe go back through your notes of Chapter 3, you'll recall that we did discuss the roadmap to ethical decision making called the decision tree, and we're just briefly going to bring this up again. So here we have the general questions. There are several questions that you can ask yourself, and by answering these questions honestly and openly, you will know if you need to move forward or if you probably don't need to move forward with an idea. We can review this again in class if we need to, but from Chapter 3, you guys seem to understand it pretty good. Also, you need to be familiar with evidence-based decision making. Now, this is something that you may not hear a lot of, especially phrased like this in the business world, because there's always an assumption that it's being done, right? That we're making decisions based off of good information, and that's not always the case. Again, it's one of those assumptions that we make from a rational model standpoint. That's just basically not always the case. So now, what is evidence-based management? It's really the translation of principles based on best evidence into organizational practice. And sometimes you may hear best evidence or you may hear best practices as well. So you may want to jot down that terminology as well. So let's take a look at the next slide. So now there are 7 implementation principles of evidence-based management. Now, Pfeffer and Sutton identified 7 implementation principles to help companies that are committed to doing what it takes to profit from evidence-based management. Okay, let's quickly review these. So you have treat your organization as an unfinished prototype. So leaders need to think and act as if their organization were an unfinished prototype that won't be ruined by dangerous new ideas or impossible to change because of employee or management resistance. And then you have no brag, just facts. This slogan is an antidote for over-the-top assertions about forthcoming products. You always want to be truthful. You can't say you have the best product ever because we don't know what's going to happen in the future, right? Saying you have the best product ever denotes the idea of there's never going to be anything better. So you just want to be actual and truthful and just factual about your data concerning new products or services. See yourself and your organization as outsiders do. So for me, I think it's good for us to have a friend that we feel comfortable with taking criticism, constructive criticism from, and they feel comfortable giving it. We all have our blind spots, so it's really good to have someone that can act as your mirror and reveal your blind spots, because sometimes you know, the things we try, the messages we try to convey, or you know, the information that we try to relay just doesn't come out the right way. Well, we need someone to tell us that, or we can spend a lot of time unintentionally and passively offending others, which could help build some more resistance against any changes or the decision-making process. Evidence-based management is not just for senior executives. So the best organizations are those in which everyone is guided by the responsibility to gather and act on qualitative and quantitative data and share results with others. Like everything else, you still need to sell it. So to sell an evidence-based approach, you may have to identify a preferred practice based on solid, if unexciting evidence. Then use vivid stories to really grab management attention and just try to sell that story. If all else fails, slow the spread of bad practice. So it may be necessary for you to ignore orders to know that you know to be wrong, or at least delay their implementation. The best diagnostic question: what happens when people fail? The answer is we learn. You know, failure hurts and it's embarrassing, and I'm sure we would rather live without it, but it's a learning process. Excuse me. And then you have general decision-making styles. So decision-making styles reflect the combination of how an individual perceives and responds to information. You have value orientation, which reflects the extent to which a person focuses on either task and technical concerns or people and social concerns when making decisions. You have the tolerance for ambiguity, which is the extent to which a person has a high need for structure or control in their life. And these actually are reflected in the figure on the next slide. So let's take a look. So 4 general decision-making styles, right? So, and as I describe these boxes and the words that are in the boxes, I want you to see if you can find yourself. Do you have a high tolerance for ambiguity, a low tolerance for ambiguity? Are you task and technical concerns focused, or are you people and social concerns focused? If so, are you people and social concerns focused with a high tolerance for ambiguity? Then you would go in the conceptual box, right? If you are task and technical concerns with a low tolerance for ambiguity, you would be in the directive box. But let's take a look at what these words actually mean. So directive: efficient, logical, practical, and systematic in your approach to solving problems, action-oriented, decisive, and you like to focus on facts. Analytical: An analytical person is very careful with decision making. They may take a little longer to actually make decisions, but they also respond well to new or uncertain situations. Conceptual person, a person that's that utilizes a conceptual decision-making style, tend to focus on the people or social aspects of a work situation, right? They take a broad perspective to problem solving and like to consider many options and future possibilities. And then you have the behavioral person or decision-making style, which is this person would be very supportive, receptive to suggestions. They show warmth. They prefer verbal to written information, and they have a tendency to avoid conflict. Now, what's important to know about this is this information will not only be good for you when you're making decisions as a manager, but if you can learn your team and how they make decision processes or their decision-making style, then that will also help with communication, right? And bringing and bridging any gaps that may be on the team, right? But one thing is true that for many decisions, you'll find yourself coming to a barrier of some sort. Now, there are 4 effective problem recognition and problem solving approaches that really act as barriers when you must make an important decision in a situation of conflict. You have the relaxed avoidance, relaxed change, defensive avoidance, and you have the panic. So now we'll discuss this a little bit more in class. I just want to give you a brief overview in this video. But be ready to discuss those 4 ineffective reactions or barriers to a decision that has been made. In deciding to decide, right, a manager agrees that he or she must decide what to do about a problem or opportunity and take effective decision-making steps. There are 3 ways to help you decide whether to decide or to evaluate the importance, credibility, and urgency of the situation. So the importance. How high priority is the situation? Do you need to determine how much, you need to determine how much priority to give the decision situation. Ask yourself if it's a threat, how extensive might prospective loss or damage be? If it's an opportunity, how beneficial might the possible gains be? As far as credibility goes, you want to ask yourself how believable is the information about the situation. So you need to evaluate how much is known about the possible threat or opportunity. You know, is the source of the information trustworthy? Is there credible evidence? And then, of course, there's urgency, right? So how quickly do you need to act on the information that you've received about the situation? Is the threat immediate? Will the window of opportunity stay open long? Can actions to address the situation actually be done gradually? We don't know until we actually take the time to answer those questions. Now, there are several common decision-making biases as well. Now, these are called heuristics, and that simplify the process of making decisions. So you have, when managers use only information that is readily available from memory to make judgments, that's an availability bias. If a representativeness bias exists, they'll refer to the tendency to generalize from a small sample or a single event. When people seek information to support their point of view and discount data that does not, a confirmation bias exists. When managers add up all the money already spent on a project and conclude it is too costly to simply abandon it, that's a sunk cost bias. The tendency to make decisions based on initial figure is anchoring and adjustment bias. And the overconfidence bias is the bias in which people's subjective confidence in their decision making is greater than their objective accuracy. And then you have the hindsight bias, which is the tendency of people to view events as being more predictable than they really are. There's the framing bias, which is the tendency of decision makers to be influenced by the way a situation or problem is presented to them. And then you have the escalation of commitment bias, which occurs when decision makers increase their commitment to a project despite negative information about it. And now this is our last slide, and it's basically a quick look at group decision making, because it's really important as a manager, even as an individual, to know how to work well with others, especially when you're making a group decision. So now, using a group to make a decision offers 5 possible advantages that we see here. You have a greater pool of knowledge, different perspectives, intellectual stimulation, better understanding of decision rationale, and deeper commitment to the decision. But for these benefits to happen, however, it's really important that your group is made up of diverse participants, not just people who all think the same. And I think that's obvious. We can discuss it more in class if we need to, but I think that's obvious why that would be important, right? Because if everybody's thinking the same, then you're probably going to come up with the same conclusions, same ideas. Then you have groupthink, in which we can discuss in class as well. But this is pretty much the overview or the introductory conversation for Chapter 7. I look forward to seeing you in class. And until then, talk to you soon.